The air in the Prime Minister's residence was thick with tobacco smoke and the unspoken weight of history. Outside, the autumn night of September 15, 1940, hung still over Tokyo. Inside, the country's most powerful men sat in uneasy silence, the kind that swallows even the sound of breathing. At the center of the long, lacquered table sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono had abandoned the usual diplomatic dance of politeness. His voice was quiet but direct. "If it comes to war with America, can we win?" Every man in the room turned toward Yamamoto. He had the kind of presence that silences generals. A veteran of Tsushima, Harvard graduate and commander of the combined fleet, he was the one man whose answer truly mattered. Yamamoto slowly crushed his cigarette into the ashtray, the ember dying like a signal light fading at sea. He let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then he spoke, voice low, deliberate, each word hitting like a drumbeat. "If I am ordered to fight, I will give you victories for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no faith in what follows." The words landed like shrapnel. A few officials shifted in their seats, pretending to look composed. But everyone understood what he had just said. Japan could win battles, not the war. He wasn't speculating. Yamamoto had walked the oil fields of Texas, counted rivets in Detroit's factories, studied America's rivers of steel and oceans of oil. He knew the cold mathematics of war. He had done the numbers long before tonight. In his mind's eye, he could already see it. Shipyards on the American coasts roaring awake, factories swallowing steel by the ton, and an industrial juggernaut grinding forward with terrifying inevitability. It wasn't prophecy. It was arithmetic. For years, Yamamoto had been a lone voice in a storm of nationalism. Politicians promised swift conquest. Generals whispered of divine spirit overpowering foreign machines. But Yamamoto had seen the truth. America wasn't just a nation. It was a continent forged into an engine. 6 months, he repeated, this time more softly, almost to himself. To Kono, the number was a military estimate. To Yamamoto, it was a death sentence written in steel and oil. He understood what few in the room dared to admit. The war would end not on a battlefield, but in the assembly lines of Detroit, in the refineries of Texas, in the endless trains of Pennsylvania. Outside, the cicadas droned in the late summer darkness. Inside, no one spoke. Someone cleared their throat. A single clock ticked. Kono finally leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Then we must hope," he said quietly, "that 6 months is enough." Yamamoto bowed slightly, as duty demanded. But inside, hope had nothing to do with it. He already knew how this story would end. Not with a decisive battle, not with a final charge, but with an empire crushed beneath a weight it could never match. As the meeting dispersed, Yamamoto lingered for a moment, gazing at the ash in the tray. That glowing ember had burned bright and then died quickly, just like the victories to come. He straightened his uniform, walked out into the night, and felt the cold air settle around him. Above Tokyo, the stars shimmered with indifferent clarity. He did not believe in omens, but he believed in numbers, and numbers never lied. Long before he became the admiral who challenged an empire, Isoroku Takano was a boy who knew hunger. He was born in 1884 in a modest house in the chilly town of Nagyaka. His father was a weary schoolteacher in his 50s, a man who carried the quiet weight of a Japan that was still clawing its way into modernity. Isoroku was the 6th son in a family with little to spare. Winter came hard to Nagyaka. The wind howled down the narrow streets like a warning, and the Takano family often went to bed with little more than barley and sweet potatoes in their stomachs. Rice, the staple of their nation, was a luxury they could rarely afford. In that small home, Yamamoto learned something he never forgot. Strength wasn't born of abundance but of survival. His very name carried the mark of hardship. Isoroku meant 56. the age his father had been when he was born. It was a name tied to time, a reminder that he had arrived in a household closer to twilight than dawn. From a young age, Yamamoto displayed an intensity that unsettled some and impressed others. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed the cracks in walls, the creak of floorboards, the small failures in the world around him, and quietly he learned how to endure them. When he entered the Imperial Naval Academy, he did so not as a son of privilege, but as a boy who had known the sharp edge of scarcity. His classmates came from wealthier families, sons of samurai and officials, but Isoroku's hunger burned deeper. It wasn't ambition alone that drove him. It was the knowledge of what it meant to have nothing. In 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, that hunger met reality. Japan's navy struck a stunning blow against the Russian Baltic Fleet, and young Yamamoto was there to witness it. The roar of guns, the shuddering decks, the smell of burning steel, he absorbed it all. A shell exploded close to his station, mangling his left hand and taking 2 fingers. Blood poured over the deck, but he didn't cry out. He watched the Russian fleet burn as a medic wrapped his hand. The victory was intoxicating for the nation. Newspapers called it divine proof that Japan could defeat great powers through will and spirit. In every celebration, in every drunken chorus of triumph, Yamamoto heard a dangerous lie-taking root, that courage alone could conquer steel. He had seen the real battle up close. Russia's defeat, he understood, wasn't because Japan was spiritually superior. It was because Russia was fighting far from home, stretched thin, struggling against internal chaos. That kind of advantage would not exist against America. The Navy adopted him after the war, as was customary to advance promising officers from humble origins. He became Isoroku Yamamoto, trading the name of a poor teacher's son for one that carried social weight. But he never forgot who he had been. Beneath the polished boots and crisp uniforms, the boy from Nagyaka still measured the world in cold nights and empty bowls. Yamamoto studied relentlessly. Naval strategy, engineering, languages. He consumed them like a starving man devouring bread. He believed knowledge was armor, and he would need armor to face the world that lay beyond Japan's shores. When he looked at the empire his country was building, he didn't just see its glory. He saw its fragility. Japan was small, resource-poor, and dependent on the very nations it would soon challenge. It was like a sword forged from fine steel but with a hollow core. A single blow could shatter it. Years later, when the admirals and ministers gathered around long polished tables and spoke of destiny, Yamamoto's mind would return to those nights in Nagyaka, to the bitter wind, to the simple meals, to the feeling of being small in a world ruled by giants. He understood Japan's hunger because it had once been his own. In the spring of 1919, a 35-year-old naval officer stepped off a train in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing disciplined, and 2 swords hung at his side, relics of a samurai tradition colliding with a modern world. Isoroku Yamamoto had come to America not to fight, but to learn. What he would witness would change not only him, but the course of history. Harvard's red brick walls were drenched in spring sunlight, the Charles River calm and wide. To the American students bustling past, he was an odd figure, a foreign officer among Ivy League youth. But Yamamoto barely noticed the stares. He had orders: study the language, observe the Navy, and report what he saw. But he had his own mission, to measure the strength of the country his nation might one day face. His English was halting at first, his accent thick. Officially, he was enrolled in a language program. Unofficially, he spent far less time in classrooms and far more in Widener Library, poring over industrial reports, oil production records, transportation maps. While his peers attended lectures on literature and philosophy, Yamamoto dissected America's bloodstream, its machines, its oil, its steel. He lived simply in a small rented room in Brookline, sleeping little, reading until dawn. His neighbors thought him obsessive. They were right. When the first summer break arrived, Yamamoto didn't travel east to see the cities. He went south. Hitchhiking with a few dollars in his pocket, he made his way toward Texas, chasing something most officers would have ignored: oil. In Beaumont, the sun scorched the fields, and derricks crowded the horizon like a forest of steel. The Spindletop field, once the birthplace of the modern oil boom, was still pumping thousands of barrels a day. The noise was constant: the groan of pumps, the clank of chains, the hiss of gas flares burning away what America considered waste. Yamamoto stood among roughnecks, taking notes in a leather book. He spoke to engineers through broken English, watched drills plunge into the earth, and traced pipelines as they disappeared toward refineries. The scale stunned him. A single well produced more oil in a day than his entire nation imported in a week. "This," he wrote in his notebook, "is not wealth. It is power. Power that moves ships, planes, armies." Japan had none of it. He spent nights in barns and fields to save money, living like a wanderer with a uniform folded carefully in his bag. To his mind, oil wasn't just fuel. It was blood, the lifeblood of modern war. Weeks later, Yamamoto traveled north again. He arrived in Detroit just before dawn, his boots coated in dust. What he saw at the Ford Highland Park plant would haunt him for the rest of his life. The shift change was a tidal wave of humanity, 20,000 workers pouring from the factory gates, most climbing into their own automobiles. In Japan, even officers didn't own cars. Here, laborers drove them home. Inside, he toured the plant, passing as a visiting engineering student. The assembly line was relentless. A Model T rolled off the line every 45 seconds. Workers repeated single motions with machine-like precision. Overhead cranes moved steel like clockwork. Raw ore entered at one end. Finished cars emerged at the other. The entire process took less than 2 hours. Yamamoto's notebook filled with numbers: workforce size, output rates, steel consumption. Ford's daily steel use exceeded Japan's weekly production. And this, he reminded himself, was one company, in one city, in one industry. He understood what many in Tokyo did not. If America could build cars this way, it could build tanks, trucks, planes, warships. It wasn't just manufacturing, it was a system. A system that could be turned toward war at terrifying speed. By the early 1920s, America produced nearly 2/3 of the world's oil. It manufactured more automobiles than all other nations combined. Its railways stretched across a continent, feeding a machine that never slept. Yamamoto saw the pattern forming in the numbers. The country's industrial muscle was so vast it barely needed to mobilize to dwarf its rivals. In the evenings, sitting in his dimly lit room, he thought of Japan, of how every ship relied on imported fuel, of how every bullet, every plane, every engine would depend on resources they didn't control. A war with America, he began to realize, wouldn't be decided by courage. It would be decided by production statistics. "Oil," he wrote in a letter to a colleague back home, "is the ocean in which America swims, and we drink from buckets." Unlike many foreign officers who spent their time socializing, Yamamoto treated America like a vast textbook. He traveled alone, watching freight trains loaded with steel thunder through the night. He lingered at shipyards, studying dry docks that dwarfed anything in Yokosuka. He watched bridges rise in days, factories appear where fields once stood. It wasn't just the scale that impressed him, it was the speed. He realized something dangerous. Even if Japan struck first, even if the empire scored early victories, America could recover faster than Japan could respond. That was a problem no battleship could solve. Before Harvard, Yamamoto had believed in Japan's power, in its ingenuity, in the strength of its navy. After months in America, something shifted inside him. He still loved his country, but now he saw it through clearer, harsher eyes. He would later tell a confidant, "They build machines the way we plant rice, one after another, endless, effortless. If we fight them, we are not fighting men, we are fighting a machine. This realization did not make him weak. It made him dangerous to his own government, because he now carried something few in the Japanese high command possessed, a precise understanding of the enemy's strength. When he returned to Cambridge for his final term, he was no longer just a naval officer abroad. He was a man carrying a prophecy, a Cassandra in uniform. He had looked inside the engine room of a colossus. The mathematics of war were already written. Japan might choose to ignore them, but Yamamoto would never forget what he saw in the heat of Texas, the noise of Detroit, the endless American night lit by oil flares. As his ship sailed back toward Japan in 1921, the wind whipped across the deck, carrying the scent of the Pacific. He stood alone at the railing, his hands folded behind his back. To everyone else on board, the journey home was a return to duty. To Yamamoto, it felt like he was carrying a warning across the ocean. The man who had once roamed Texas oil fields with a notebook returned to America in 1926, this time not as a student, but as Japan's naval attaché in Washington. He wore the polished uniform of a senior officer, but he moved with the same quiet intensity as before. What had begun at Harvard was now an official mission: to study the world's most powerful industrial nation from the inside. The Japanese embassy on Massachusetts Avenue was a formal, cautious place. Diplomatic banquets, receptions, polite exchanges, all were meant to project harmony between nations. But Yamamoto had little interest in empty gestures. By day, he attended naval conferences, memorized speeches, and shook hands with men who would one day be his enemies. By night, he set out to see America's beating industrial heart. The country he had left behind in 1921 had already grown stronger. Production numbers had leapt upward like a living tide. Oil output had doubled. Automobile manufacturing soared past 4 million vehicles a year. Steel poured from furnaces like rivers of light. Yamamoto began keeping a meticulous schedule. Mondays through Wednesdays, he played the part of the diplomat, listening, observing, quietly nodding. Thursdays through Sundays, he vanished into the interior of the United States. He visited steel mills in Pennsylvania, where sparks fell like fire rain as massive ingots were hammered into naval armor. He toured oil refineries in New Jersey, watching entire oceans of crude turned into fuel in a single day. He walked the sprawling yards of Bethlehem Steel, noting how specialized furnaces could forge the plates that protected American warships in hours, a process that would take Japanese yards weeks. At every stop, he measured and calculated. He had become a hunter of numbers. If Yamamoto's public life was made of inspections and official trips, his private campaign was waged at a poker table. Every Friday night, in the quiet of his apartment, he invited American naval officers, diplomats, and intelligence men to play cards. On the surface, it was a social game: whiskey, laughter, the rhythmic shuffle of cards. In truth, it was one of the most subtle intelligence operations of the interwar years. Yamamoto was a master at reading people. He could recall every card played, track odds in his head, and watch for flickers of emotion in his opponent's eyes. He learned something far more important than naval specifications. He learned how Americans thought. They played boldly, even when holding weak hands. They bet high, not because they were reckless, but because they knew they could afford to lose. That mentality, Yamamoto realized, was strategic DNA. A nation with resources so vast could absorb setbacks without collapsing. Japan could not. Japan was playing with borrowed chips against a man who owned the bank. He would later tell a colleague, half in jest but fully in truth, "In war as in poker, they can lose 10 hands and still win the game." He visited the Bethlehem steel plant repeatedly, sketching its layout in his personal notebooks. The furnaces burned day and night, devouring coal and iron to produce armor plate for the U.S. Navy. Electric furnaces allowed constant, high-volume production with precision Japanese industry could barely imagine. In Birmingham, Alabama, he traced the supply chain feeding that steel. Ore trains arrived with the punctuality of clockwork, connecting mines in Minnesota, coal fields in Pennsylvania, and limestone quarries across the Midwest. Thousands of miles of material flowed with machine precision. This wasn't just industrial strength. It was integration, a seamless system that made the United States not just productive, but unstoppable once fully mobilized. Yamamoto had been trained to think in terms of fleet engagements and battleships, but standing in those factories, watching conveyor belts move raw power through furnaces, he began to think like an economist. A war against such a nation wouldn't be decided by a decisive battle at sea. It would be a war of attrition, and attrition was a game Japan could not play. In the mid-1920s, naval thinking was still chained to battleships, but Yamamoto's instincts told him to look upward. He visited aircraft factories in Ohio, where planes rolled off production lines like cars in Detroit. He saw workers, many of whom had never touched an airplane before, assembling engines and frames with astonishing speed. He saw wind tunnels, test facilities, engineering labs that outnumbered Japan's entire aeronautical corps. American manufacturers were producing thousands of planes annually, while Japan struggled to build a few hundred, often with imported engines. Yamamoto understood the implications. Control of the sky would shape the next war, and America was already far ahead. He wrote in one of his reports, "While we polish our battleships, they build wings, and wings do not rust." In 1928, as his assignment drew to a close, Yamamoto compiled a classified report unlike any other. It wasn't filled with poetic warnings or vague assessments. It was mathematics, columns of oil output, tonnage of steel, factory capacities, shipyard expansion rates, rail freight efficiency, aircraft production forecasts. His conclusion was blunt. In every critical category, American industrial capacity exceeds Japan's by tenfold or more. If war comes, the outcome is decided before the first shot is fired. He sent the report to Tokyo. It was filed away, mostly unread by the men who would later drag the country into war. His clear-eyed view of America began to make enemies at home. Some officers whispered that he was too Americanized. He drank coffee instead of tea, smoked Lucky Strikes, and quoted Ford's assembly line statistics with unnerving precision. Nationalists saw his warnings as weakness, not foresight. Ultramilitarists called him a defeatist. But Yamamoto didn't speak from fear. He spoke from certainty. He had seen their factories. He had watched their planes take shape, their oil flow, their trains roll. He knew what 6 months of war would mean. A flurry of Japanese victories, followed by a tide too massive to stop. On the night before he boarded the ship back to Japan, Yamamoto stood on the deck looking at the lights of San Francisco fading behind him. The Golden Gate had not yet been built, but the harbor pulsed with movement, ships, cranes, lights stretching into the black water. It was a city alive with energy, the heartbeat of a nation that would soon shake the world. He drew in a long breath, hands clasped behind his back, and murmured to no one, "They are already ready, we just refuse to see it." The Pacific wind whipped against his face. For most officers, the end of an attaché tour meant a return to status and comfort. For Yamamoto, it meant returning home carrying a prophecy he knew few would heed. When the ship turned toward the horizon, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. America's power was burned into his mind, with the precision of numbers carved in steel. The 1930s were years of marching boots and raised flags. Around the world, nations armed themselves for storms they pretended not to see. In Japan, the storm was already inside the house. Militarism had become the language of power, and few voices dared to question it. Among the rising chorus of hawks stood one man who whispered warnings no one wanted to hear: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. By the early 1930s, Japan's imperial ambitions were no longer subtle. Manchuria had been invaded. Puppet governments were installed. The newspapers printed maps that stretched Japanese influence deep into China, painting it as destiny. Crowds filled the streets shouting patriotic slogans. Students were taught that their empire was divinely chosen to rule Asia. Behind that nationalist fervor, Yamamoto saw a different picture, a nation with ambition far greater than its resources. He knew exactly how much oil Japan imported. He knew how fragile its shipping lines were. He knew how few factories could build modern engines. For every battleship proudly launched in Yokosuka, America could launch 5 without breaking a sweat. He spoke these truths in rooms that grew colder as he spoke. Victory will not come from spirit alone, he told a gathering of senior officers in 1935. Victory will belong to the one who can build longer, not shout louder. The applause was thin, the silence after heavier than gunfire. Yamamoto's bluntness made him enemies. His warnings were not only inconvenient, they were dangerous to those who thrived on illusions. Ultranationalists saw him as a threat to the myth of invincibility they had carefully built. Rumors spread. Angry pamphlets called him coward and American puppet. Some of those whispers turned into death threats. He shrugged them off in public, but his aides quietly altered his routines, changing travel times, surrounding him with security. Once, returning to Tokyo late at night, he found a note nailed to his door. It read simply, "The war will come. Stand with the nation or be crushed beneath it." He folded the paper neatly and burned it in his ashtray. Yamamoto rose steadily through the ranks, not because he was loved, but because he was too skilled to ignore. He mastered strategy, diplomacy, logistics. His opponents respected his mind even as they loathed his message. In 1934, at the London Naval Conference, he argued fiercely against war with the United States. When a Japanese admiral declared that their spiritual strength would crush the Americans, Yamamoto replied with quiet precision. Spirit does not build ships. Spirit does not fill fuel tanks. Spirit does not forge steel. He returned to Japan with his knuckles bruised. Some called it a scuffle, others a heated exchange. Either way, his stance was clear. Picking a fight with the United States was suicide. The more he warned, the more isolated he became. The army dominated national policy, intoxicated with victories in China and convinced the West would fold under pressure. To them, Yamamoto was a naval officer with too much respect for the enemy. In private, Yamamoto wrestled with his duty. He loved the Navy. He loved his country. But patriotism to him was not blind obedience. It was telling the truth, even when the truth was unwelcome. He once confided to a close aide, "If they drag this nation into a war with America, they will be leading a child against a giant. I will fight if ordered, but I will not lie about the cost." In 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident ignited full-scale war with China. Japan's armies marched deeper inland, burning through resources at a staggering pace. War was supposed to bring easy victory and economic security. Instead, it created a hunger that grew with every mile. Yamamoto watched shipping records pile on his desk, fuel reserves dropping, supply lines straining, imports tightening like a noose. The empire was building a war it could not sustain. Still, the hawks circled louder. They claimed that America would not dare fight, that the West was decadent, soft, unwilling to bleed. Yamamoto clenched his jaw whenever he heard those words. He had played poker with Americans. He had walked their factories. He had seen the flares of their oil fields burn through the night. "They will fight," he whispered one night, alone in his study. "And when they fight, they will not stop." In 1939, Yamamoto became commander-in-chief of the Combined Fleet, the most powerful naval position in the empire. It was a title that brought immense responsibility but little comfort. He knew what the admirals around him whispered, that he would be the man to lead them into the Great Pacific War. He responded with what seemed like a contradiction. He designed the Pearl Harbor attack plan, even as he opposed the war itself. To him, it was simple. If the Empire insisted on leaping into the fire, then he would at least ensure the first strike was devastating. The only hope, thin as a blade, was to shock the United States so deeply that it would sue for peace before its giant could fully awaken. But in his heart he knew better. He had said it in 1940, 6 months, perhaps a year. Then the tide would turn. By the end of the decade, Yamamoto walked through Tokyo like a man carrying a future no one wanted to face. Crowds cheered the empire's expansion. Newspapers spoke of destiny. But destiny, Yamamoto knew, was written in oil barrels and steel production charts. He wasn't just fighting foreign enemies. He was fighting the illusions of his own nation. The Hawks saw glory on the horizon. Yamamoto saw a slow-motion disaster. And yet, duty would soon demand the unthinkable of him. The man who had warned against war would lead the opening blow. The sky above the Pacific was black and windless on the night of December 6, 1941. A vast armada moved silently through the dark waters, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. It was the most powerful naval strike force Japan had ever assembled, and at its center stood the architect of the entire operation, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He stood alone on the deck of the flagship Nagato, coat collar pulled up against the cold. Behind him, the officers busied themselves with final confirmations. In front of him, the horizon stretched toward Hawaii, where the U.S. Pacific Fleet slept at anchor. He had spent years trying to prevent this war. Now he was about to begin it. The Pearl Harbor attack plan was Yamamoto's creation, born not from hope of victory but from a desperate calculus. If Japan must fight, he argued, it must strike first, and strike so hard that the Americans would hesitate to fight a long war. He had studied the operation in merciless detail. Launch waves of aircraft at dawn. Hit battleships at anchor. Cripple the fleet before it leaves port. Buy 6 months of breathing room. To many in Tokyo, it sounded glorious. To Yamamoto, it was a roll of the dice against a giant. He leaned against the railing and whispered into the wind, "Forgive me for what I must do." At 7:55 a.m. December 7th, the first wave roared over Oahu. American sailors looked up into a sky filled with the rising sun on red circles, Japanese aircraft diving out of the morning light. Bombs fell like iron rain. The harbor erupted in flame and water. The battleship Arizona exploded in a blinding flash, a steel volcano tearing itself apart. The Oklahoma rolled over like a wounded beast. Smoke turned the sky black. Sirens wailed. Men dove into burning, oil-slicked water. From a command center far away, Yamamoto received the coded confirmation. The attack was a success. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been smashed. Battleships were burning, aircraft destroyed, the base in chaos. To the war hawks in Tokyo, it was a triumph beyond their dreams. But Yamamoto did not cheer. He stared at the decoded message in silence. For everyone else, Pearl Harbor was a beginning. For him, it was the beginning of the end. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he murmured to his chief of staff, and filled him with a terrible resolve. The words were not for effect, he meant them. The attack had been brilliant, tactically perfect, almost surgical. American battleships lay crippled at their moorings. Hundreds of planes were destroyed. For a moment, Japan controlled the Pacific. But Yamamoto's mind was already far from the burning harbor. He thought of the oil wells in Texas, the factories in Detroit, the shipyards of California. None of them had been touched. The true arsenal of America lay untouched, deep inland. Tokyo celebrated. The newspapers called it divine retribution. Crowds filled the streets. Nationalist politicians declared the United States broken. Yamamoto listened to their speeches with a face carved in stone. He knew better. Japan had won a battle. It had just entered a war it could not win. In the following weeks, Japanese forces struck like lightning Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya. It was a string of victories so fast and dazzling that even Yamamoto's critics hailed him as a genius. But each victory cost fuel. Each advance stretched supply lines. Japan's oil reserves, already limited, began to shrink dangerously. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes. And somewhere across the Pacific, the American machine was waking up. Yamamoto spent sleepless nights in his cabin, poring over logistics reports. His staff brought him maps with flags marking fresh conquests. He barely looked at them. He asked only one question: how much fuel remains? While Japan celebrated, the United States mobilized with terrifying speed. Shipyards that had been quiet exploded with activity. Car factories retooled to build tanks and aircraft. Women filled assembly lines. Men flooded recruitment centers. In 1941, the U.S. Navy had 7 fleet carriers. By 1944, it would have nearly 30. The U.S. shipyards could build a destroyer in weeks, a carrier in months. Japan took years. Yamamoto had foreseen this very tidal wave years earlier in Detroit and Pennsylvania. Tokyo dismissed it as American softness. Yamamoto knew it was the soft soil in which steel would grow. In Imperial General Headquarters, politicians and generals congratulated themselves. The Pearl Harbor attack had united the nation, silenced critics, and humiliated the West. But Yamamoto sat in meetings with folded arms, silent as others boasted of a quick war. When asked for his opinion, he spoke plainly. "We can win for 6 months. After that, I guarantee nothing." They laughed it off as caution. But behind closed doors, a few began to fear him, not for weakness, but because he saw too clearly. He spent much of early 1942 at Hashirajima, headquarters of the combined fleet. Every morning, he walked the deck before sunrise, a solitary figure staring east toward America. The officers admired him, feared him, and could never quite understand him. To them, Pearl Harbor was proof of Japanese strength. To him, it was proof of American potential. He wrote to a close friend, "They believe we have won. I believe we have bought time, nothing more." Yamamoto ordered his staff to plan further strikes. The Coral Sea, Midway, the Aleutians, not out of confidence, but to keep the giant off balance for as long as possible. Every operation was a move, in a game he knew was already rigged. Yamamoto carried 2 wars on his shoulders, one against the United States, fought with ships and planes, and another against the illusions of his own nation, fought with silence and grim resolve. He did not allow himself the comfort of hope. He had seen what waited beyond 6 months, a flood of ships, endless planes, a war Japan could not outbuild. When his subordinates asked about the ultimate strategy, he gave no speeches. He merely traced a slow curve across a map of the Pacific, moving from Pearl Harbor to California, whispering, "The ocean is wide, but not wide enough." The first waves of American response were already in motion. Shipyards on both coasts were roaring. New carriers like Hornet and Enterprise were ready to fight. The Pacific that had seemed empty would soon be filled with steel hulls. Yamamoto didn't need to guess how fast they would come. He had measured those factories himself 2 decades earlier. The countdown he had spoken in Tokyo had begun. 6 months, maybe a year. After that, the giant would be fully awake. On the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, many years later, officers would remember Yamamoto's silence. No toast, no celebration, just the admiral staring out at the Pacific as fireworks erupted over Tokyo. He had given Japan its greatest short-term victory. But he had also, unwillingly, opened the door to its eventual defeat. The night the attack succeeded, Yamamoto walked the dark deck of Nagato, the stars cold and sharp above him. Somewhere far to the east, American factories burned with light, not from fire, from industry. Now, he whispered, it begins. Spring 1942. The Pacific no longer felt vast. It felt alive, a stage on which two giants were testing their strength. For the first 6 months, the rising sun had cast its glow over an empire expanding at breathtaking speed. But beneath that golden surface, the tide had already begun to turn. And no one understood that better than Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had promised Japan 6 months of victories. The clock was ticking. In Washington and across the American heartland, the attack on Pearl Harbor had done something far more dangerous than destroy ships. It had unified a divided nation. Factories that had once made cars now forged tanks and planes. Shipyards worked day and night. Young men who had never seen the ocean enlisted to fight across it. In just a few months, American industry became an army of its own. In April, Yamamoto received reports on American ship production. Destroyers completed in weeks, carriers in months, cargo ships in fleets. It was exactly what he had calculated years earlier in Detroit and Texas. The giant was stirring, and faster than he had feared. They will not stop, he told his staff. This is only the beginning. Japan's victories had been spectacular. The Philippines fell. Singapore, once called Fortress Britain, collapsed in days. The Dutch East Indies, with its precious oil, was under Japanese control. A vast empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But Yamamoto saw the shadow beneath the triumph. Every mile gained stretched supply lines thinner. Every conquest demanded oil and ships. Japan's industrial engine was too small to sustain the weight of an empire this large. Its fleets ran on borrowed time and borrowed fuel. The oil fields of Southeast Asia provided some relief, but shipping it back to Japan was perilous. American submarines were already beginning to cut the arteries of the empire. For the politicians in Tokyo, the empire was a map of glory. For Yamamoto, it was a fragile machine waiting to break. In May, Yamamoto watched the first cracks appear. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese carriers met the Americans in direct combat for the first time. The battle ended inconclusively, technically a Japanese tactical victory, but the cost was heavy. For the first time, Japan had lost the element of surprise. He studied the battle reports in silence. The enemy had matched them in the air. Their carrier pilots were better than expected. Their ships faster to repair, faster to replace. At the same time, American bombers struck Tokyo itself in the Doolittle raid. The material damage was minor, but the psychological impact was profound. The Americans had reached into Japan's heart. Yamamoto's eyes hardened when he read the dispatch. He understood. The giant was no longer stirring, it was rising to its feet. They are coming, he told his operations officer. Soon they will be everywhere. The admiral's response was not born of arrogance but of strategy. If Japan was to have any chance of survival, it needed one decisive blow to cripple America before it fully mobilized. Midway became that gamble. Yamamoto designed the operation with the precision of a surgeon. A trap to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into the open, crush them, and force the Americans to negotiate from weakness. It was desperation wearing the mask of confidence. His staff questioned the complexity of the plan. Too many moving parts, too many assumptions. Yamamoto brushed them aside with quiet gravity. "We have no choice," he said. "This is the moment. If we do not strike now, we will never strike again." The Japanese fleet set sail in late May. Yamamoto followed aboard Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, a floating symbol of imperial pride. Deep inside, however, he carried the weight of inevitability. The storm he had warned of was here. On June 4, 1942, the trap snapped not on the Americans but on Japan. U.S. codebreakers had anticipated every move. American carriers struck first, catching the Japanese fleet mid-rearmament. In a matter of hours, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, were turned into floating infernos. These were the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. Their loss was catastrophic. Japan had neither the industrial base nor the pilot reserves to replace them quickly. Aboard Yamamoto received the reports one by one. He said nothing. He didn't slam the table or curse the enemy. He simply removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and whispered, "So it begins." Staff officers would later remember the expression on his face, not shock, but recognition. It was the face of a man watching a prophecy unfold with brutal precision. After Midway, American shipyards shifted into overdrive. New carriers slid down launching ramps almost monthly. Aircraft production skyrocketed. The same assembly lines Yamamoto had once walked through in Detroit now fed the war machine that was coming for him. By the end of 1942, America's naval power was growing faster than Japan could sink it. Convoys moved across the Pacific like rolling tides. Tankers delivered rivers of oil. Liberty ships carried more steel, ammunition, and planes than the Imperial Navy could hope to intercept. Japan, meanwhile, was burning through its reserves. Yamamoto saw the numbers every morning. The graphs were simple and merciless. America's curve rising, Japan's falling. The mathematics he had scribbled as a young officer were no longer projections. They were reality. In Tokyo, politicians struggled to reconcile the triumphant rhetoric of empire with the grim facts arriving from the front. Yamamoto's reports were always clear, always honest, and always unwelcome. They asked him if the situation could still be saved. He replied with the same cold arithmetic. Every ship they lose, they replace with 3. Every plane we destroy, they build 10. We are not fighting men, we are fighting numbers. The words hung in the council chamber like smoke. Few dared argue, but fewer still acted. Yamamoto began to feel like a man shouting into a storm. By late 1942, Yamamoto carried the weight of inevitable defeat on his shoulders. He hid it behind precise uniforms and calm tones, but his aides noticed the change. His walks on deck grew longer, his poker games fewer. He spent hours alone in his cabin, staring at maps covered in red pins, each one a reminder of Japan's shrinking options. He did not waver in his duty. He planned, he fought, he commanded. But inside, he already knew how the story would end. America would outbuild them, outfuel them, outlast them. And he, the man who had tried to stop the war, would command its losing fleet. "We are children who have stolen candy," he told his operations officer, "and the adult is walking down the hall." The 6 months he had promised were over. Pearl Harbor lay far behind. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable now faced a flood of steel and fire. Yamamoto watched the Pacific horizon each dawn from Yamato's deck. It was no longer a distant threat. It was coming closer every day: convoys, aircraft, submarines, carriers. An ocean no longer belonged to Japan alone. The giant was not just awake. It was marching west. The Pacific was no longer quiet. By 1943, the ocean that once carried Japanese conquests now carried American convoys, fleets, and a storm of steel. It was everything Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned of: the war not of spirit, but of production. And the arithmetic that had haunted him for years now played out in brutal clarity. The 6 months of triumph were over. The long defeat had begun. Every morning aboard Yamamoto's aides brought him new reports: American shipbuilding numbers, oil production charts, aircraft output tallies. Each set of figures was a hammer blow. While Japan struggled to repair a damaged carrier, the United States launched 3 new ones. While Japan rationed oil to keep its fleet at sea, America flooded entire task forces with fuel from wells that seemed endless. "It's mathematics," Yamamoto told his staff. "They will not run out, we will." In 1942 alone, American shipyards produced more vessels than Japan could hope to match in the entire war. By early 1943, B-24 bombers were rolling off assembly lines every hour, destroyers were sliding into the water in fleets, and Liberty ships filled the Pacific like iron shoals. Yamamoto had seen those assembly lines 2 decades earlier, and now they were building his defeat. Japan's conquests had overextended its lifelines. Oil from the Dutch East Indies had to travel through vast stretches of ocean. American submarines lurked beneath those waves, tearing the empire's supply lines apart. Tankers disappeared one by one, sinking into the dark. The empire was bleeding out through invisible wounds. The Battle of Midway was more than a defeat. It was a turning point written in fire. Japan had lost 4 carriers, ships that couldn't be replaced in time. Worse, it had lost hundreds of elite pilots. The men who had once owned the skis over the Pacific were gone, and their replacements were young, undertrained, and terrified. Yamamoto understood what few others dared to say aloud. Midway wasn't a battle they had lost. It was the war being decided in slow motion. He no longer spoke of bold offensives. His staff noticed a shift in tone, quieter meetings, longer silences, a commander carrying the weight of prophecy. He wasn't planning how to win anymore. He was calculating how long they could delay the inevitable. By 1943, the Imperial Navy no longer resembled the force that had struck Pearl Harbor. Fuel shortages kept capital ships anchored for weeks at a time. Training flights were cut back. Escort vessels were scarce. And still, convoys to Southeast Asia had to sail, or the empire would starve. Yamamoto studied the fuel figures and saw a slow death written in barrels. "Without oil," he told his chief of staff, "our fleet is nothing but steel statues." The Americans, meanwhile, surged forward with energy that felt endless. Carriers, cruisers, submarines, they moved across the Pacific like tides. They didn't have to conserve fuel. They didn't have to wait for parts. They didn't have to calculate losses. They simply replaced whatever was lost and then doubled it. The contrast was merciless. One nation was running out of everything. The other seemed to have everything to spare. In Tokyo, politicians and generals clung to illusions. Propaganda still spoke of a decisive battle that would shatter American morale. They pictured a glorious final engagement where Japanese spirit would triumph over material strength. Yamamoto no longer argued with them. He had done that for years. Instead, he spoke in numbers. "For every plane we build, they build 10, he said during one heated meeting. "For every ship we launch, they launch 5. You cannot win a war by asking mathematics to lie." His bluntness was met with uncomfortable silence. The men around the table shifted in their seats but changed nothing. They were trapped in their own myth. Across Japan, the war's reality began to show. Rationing grew severe. Factories strained under shortages. Soldiers at the front lines felt the lack of fuel, ammunition, spare parts. Civilians went hungry. But in America, the opposite was happening. Factories were running at full capacity. Young pilots trained on endless fuel. Ships arrived faster than the Navy could crew them. America wasn't exhausted, it was gaining momentum. Yamamoto could feel that momentum like the rumble of distant thunder. It grew louder with every passing month. Outwardly, Yamamoto remained calm, commanding, methodical. He visited bases, inspected defenses, planned operations. But those closest to him saw the cracks in the mask. He grew quieter at briefings. He lingered longer at night on the decks, staring into the dark ocean. He stopped playing poker. His letters to friends grew sparse and heavy. One aide wrote later that it was as if he had already seen the end of the war. He had. "We are on a river," Yamamoto told his operations officer during one of these late-night walks, "and the current only goes one way." In 1943, the avalanche Yamamoto feared fully arrived. 17 new fleet carriers joined the Pacific Fleet in just 18 months. 76 escort carriers followed. Airfields multiplied across islands like stepping stones toward Japan. American oil production dwarfed Japan's entire strategic reserves. B-24s and B-29s thundered across the skies. Task forces moved with speed Japan couldn't match. Every battle was no longer about skill or courage. It was about weight. The weight of numbers, the weight of production, the weight of inevitability. Yamamoto continued to lead because he felt he must. It was not hope that kept him going, it was duty. He believed that if the war had to be lost, it should be lost with discipline and honor, not chaos. But inside, he carried the heaviest knowledge of any man in Japan. The war was already lost. He wrote to a close friend, "I walk each day with the ghosts of what I warned them. The ghost of oil wells in Texas. The ghost of Ford's assembly lines. The ghost of steel in Pittsburgh. They march with me, and I cannot silence them." He was a man fighting time itself. Even as Japanese troops fought bravely across scattered islands, Yamamoto saw what few in Tokyo allowed themselves to admit. The Americans no longer reacted, they advanced. Every battle pushed closer to Japan's doorstep. He issued orders to prepare defenses, to stretch every drop of fuel, to salvage what could be salvaged. But he also prepared something else, his fleet, for a war it could not win. Yamamoto wasn't trying to defeat America anymore. He was trying to slow the avalanche. By early 1943, the world had become what Yamamoto had described years before over cigarettes and maps, a war determined not by courage, but by capacity. His 6 months had passed exactly as he said. Now the giant he had warned of was fully awake, armed, and moving relentlessly west. He no longer had illusions, and he no longer offered any. In his final briefings, he spoke simply and without flourish. "The Americans will keep coming. They can fight for 10 years if they wish. We can fight for 2, perhaps less." His officers listened, pale and silent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was louder than any speech. April 18, 1943. The sky over the Solomon Islands was blue and clear, the kind of morning that makes war feel far away until it finds you. On that day, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had tried to stop the war, the man who had started it anyway, climbed aboard a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber for what would become his final journey. He buttoned his flight jacket carefully, as he always did, adjusting each glove with precision. His aides offered last-minute reports, convoy movements, fleet positions, weather patterns. He nodded, barely listening. He had spent decades calculating, warning, commanding. Now, at 59, he moved with the calm of a man who understood that some things were no longer in his hands. "We must not grow careless," he said softly. "The enemy watches everything." He had no idea how true those words were. The purpose of the trip was routine, a morale visit to forward bases in the Solomon Islands. His presence alone could lift the spirits of weary soldiers and pilots. Yamamoto had always believed a commander must stand close to his men, not above them. But there was a danger he underestimated. American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher. They knew his exact flight plan, time, altitude, even the tail number of the aircraft. In a room on Guadalcanal, American officers studied the message and made a decision. They launched Operation Vengeance. A squadron of P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Henderson Field, flying low across the ocean to avoid detection. Their target was not just an enemy plane. It was the man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto sat in the co-pilot's seat, gazing through the cockpit glass as the jungle spread out beneath him. He carried with him a notebook, some papers, and his familiar cigarette case. His mind wandered perhaps to Nagyaka, perhaps to Pearl Harbor, perhaps to the warnings that had gone unheeded. Behind him, the escort fighters flew in tight formation. Everything was calm. Then the radio crackled. A sharp voice cut through. Enemy aircraft inbound. At 9:34 a.m., the American P-38s appeared out of the blue, streaks of silver sunlight and deadly purpose. They had flown over 400 miles to intercept him. The Japanese escorts reacted instantly, breaking formation, climbing, twisting through the sky. The air filled with the roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns. But the Americans had surprise and altitude. The trap snapped shut. Yamamoto's bomber dove toward the tree line, engines screaming. The P-38s closed in fast. A burst of .50 caliber fire tore through the fuselage. One engine caught fire. The tail shredded apart. Inside the cockpit, Yamamoto remained calm, as though he had expected this end all along. The Betty lurched downward, banking over the green jungle. For an instant, the plane seemed to hover on a knife's edge between sky and earth. Then it vanished into the trees. A plume of smoke rose above the canopy. Hours later, Japanese soldiers found the wreck. The bomber lay crumpled like a wounded bird. Inside, Yamamoto was still strapped to his seat, upright, hand on his sword. A single bullet wound through his jaw and neck. His watch had stopped at 9:45 a.m. His body was carried out of the jungle in silence. Even the soldiers who had grown hardened to death felt the weight of this one. They wrapped him carefully, as if afraid to disturb something larger than the man himself. The man who had warned his nation it could not win, had fallen in a war it could no longer escape. News of his death was kept secret at first, but the Americans knew. In Washington, the operation was hailed as a precision strike. They had not killed a nameless enemy, they had struck at the architect of Pearl Harbor. But among the pilots who had downed him, there was little celebration. One of them, Rex Barber, would later say, "He was a warrior, we just got there first." For Yamamoto, there was no grand battle at sea, no heroic last command. Just a quiet seat in a bomber, a sky he had once commanded, and the machine of war finally catching up to him. When the news reached Tokyo, it hit like a hammer. Yamamoto's death was not merely the loss of a commander. It was the loss of the last voice of clarity in a war drowning in delusion. He was given a state funeral, the streets filled with mourners. Planes flew overhead in tight formations. Drums echoed through the capital. Propaganda declared him a martyr of imperial destiny. But those who truly understood, officers who had worked beside him, staff who had read his reports, felt something different, a deep, hollow silence. The one man who had seen the storm coming was gone. "The fleet has lost its rudder," one admiral whispered at the ceremony. "Now the storm will take us." Yamamoto's image was carefully sculpted by the state, heroic, resolute, a warrior who struck the first blow and gave his life for the emperor. But the real man was more complex. He was the reluctant architect of a war he never wanted, the prophet of a defeat he could not stop. He had warned them in 1920, in 1930, in 1940. They had not listened. And so, on a quiet morning in 1943, the war he predicted finally reached him. By the time of Yamamoto's death, the U.S. war machine was in full motion. American forces had landed in Guadalcanal. New carriers filled the Pacific. Bombers darkened the skies. Japan's empire was already in retreat. Yamamoto did not live to see Tokyo in flames or the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. But he saw it coming in the language he understood best: numbers, logistics, capacity. He had read the future long before it arrived. And in that future, there had never been room for victory. In Nagyaka, his hometown, an old wooden house still stood, the house of a boy who once stared at empty rice bowls in cold winters. It was there that the seed of his clarity had been planted. He had always known how fragile power was. He had always understood hunger. He had risen higher than any boy from that cold house could have dreamed. And yet, in the end, the wind that carried him to war carried him home, not in triumph, but in silence. His ashes were returned to Japan, carried through the streets in a black urn wrapped in white cloth. The people bowed. The war raged on. But the man who had once whispered about a sleeping giant was gone. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died in the skis over the Solomon Islands, the war still had 2 brutal years left to run. Cities would burn. Millions would perish. Empires would collapse. But in a way, his war ended the moment his prediction came true. He had always said it. If I am told to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. But beyond that, I can guarantee nothing. And it had happened exactly as he warned. 6 months of brilliant victories, then the slow, unstoppable turn. After Yamamoto's death, the Imperial Navy drifted without the clear, unflinching vision he had provided. Admirals who followed him lacked either his strategic mind or his political courage. The war machine ground on, but without direction, a fleet with no rudder in a rising storm. Tokyo continued to speak of decisive victories, but the war became a series of retreats, of desperate stands, of dwindling resources. The United States, the sleeping giant Yamamoto had feared, advanced island by island, ship by ship, until the empire itself was exposed. Yamamoto's photograph hung in naval offices across Japan. To the public, he was immortalized as a hero, the man of Pearl Harbor, the fearless commander. But among those who truly knew him, he was remembered differently, as the man who saw the fire before it started. Yamamoto's genius had never been about mysticism or blind faith. It was about clarity. He understood power not as slogans or speeches, but as the hard mathematics of oil, steel, industry, and time. He was the young officer who wandered through Texas oil fields and Detroit factories, taking notes while others ignored. He was the admiral who spoke of America's strength when others dismissed it. He was the man who fought a war he knew was already lost, not because he wanted to, but because duty left him no choice. In the end, he didn't just fight the United States. He fought his own country's illusions and lost. After the war, American officers who had studied Yamamoto described him with a single word: formidable. He had understood them, their psychology, their capacity, their will to fight better than almost anyone in Japan. One historian would later write, "He was not defeated at Midway or Guadalcanal. He was defeated years earlier in the numbers he carried in his head." Those numbers had never lied. The oil wells, the assembly lines, the shipyards, they were the real enemy. Yamamoto had seen it coming when few would listen. Today, Yamamoto remains one of the most complex figures of the Second World War. To some, a brilliant naval commander. To others, a tragic figure, a man who unlocked the gates of a war he did not believe in. His life was a contradiction, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and also the man who feared what that act would unleash, a warrior of discipline and a prophet ignored. In his hometown of Nagyaka, a statue of Yamamoto stands quietly beneath the changing seasons. Tourists pass. Veterans salute. Children learn his name in history lessons. But the wind that moves through that small town is the same wind that once carried his fleet across the Pacific. And if you listen closely, it seems to whisper the same warning. Do not mistake spirit for strength. Do not wake the giant. He did not live to see the flames over Tokyo or the shadow of Hiroshima, but his voice echoes through history not as a conqueror's shout, but as a warning, quiet, precise, relentless. The numbers he carried were heavier than any sword. Isoroku Yamamoto, the reluctant warrior, the architect of victory and defeat, the tragic prophet of Japan's greatest war, had been right all along.